The last thing Nurse Margaret Ellison did before she fell asleep on the night of June 5th, 1944, was write a letter to her mother. She wrote that the field was beautiful, that the French countryside smelled like grass and something sweet she could not name, that she was not afraid. She folded the letter, put it under her cot, and closed her eyes. She never finished it. But we will come back to that. June 5th, 1944. Southern England. A converted farmhouse, 12 kilometers from the coast. Captain James Holloway was 31 years old, and he had already survived 2 wars that most men did not survive one of. North Africa. Sicily. He had the kind of face that stopped smiling in 1942 and never fully started again. Not because he was broken, because he had learned something that most men learn too late or never learn at all. The soldiers who died were not always the unlucky ones. Sometimes they were the ones who trusted their own instincts over the plan, who moved when they were told to hold, who second-guessed the people who could see the whole picture when they could only see their corner of it. In Sicily, Holloway had wanted to advance. His commanding officer had ordered a retreat. Holloway had felt it in his teeth, that wrongness, that itch to push forward. He had obeyed. 3 hours later, he stood on a ridge and looked down at the ambush that had been waiting for them. 42 men went home because someone higher up had known something Holloway did not. He had never forgotten that. He was reviewing troop positions when the door opened and Colonel Edmund Ferris walked in. Ferris did not knock. Ferris never knocked. He was intelligence, which meant he inhabited a different category of authority than the men with mud on their boots. His uniform was always pressed. His boots were always clean. And his eyes were always doing something that felt less like looking and more like pricing things. He dropped a sealed folder on the table and sat down without being invited. He said, "I need you to listen, and I need you to not ask questions until I am finished." Holloway said nothing, which was his way of agreeing. Ferris opened the folder. Inside a German signals unit, 12 kilometers east of the Normandy coast, there was a man. British intelligence. 9 months embedded. His information had redirected 3 bombing campaigns, had identified 2 planned German counterattacks before they launched, had saved, conservatively, several hundred Allied lives. He was still active, still transmitting, and the Germans had begun to suspect a leak. Not him specifically. Not yet. But they were watching. Any British military engagement in a specific corridor, anything that responded too precisely to German movement, could expose the pattern. And if the pattern was exposed, the man was dead. The directive was simple. Holloway's unit would hold the southern edge of that corridor. No engagement without an authorization code from the command post. The code was Amber Gate. Without it, regardless of what Holloway observed, his unit would hold. Holloway read the directive. He said, "There is a medical support camp 3 kilometers behind our position." Ferris said, "I am aware." Holloway said, "Wounded from the beach landings will be moved there in the first hours. If anything moves through that corridor unopposed," Ferris said, "Captain, the agent has confirmed the corridor will not be used as an armor route. German command is pushing north, not west. The assessment is solid." Holloway looked at the map. He looked at the corridor. He thought about 42 men on a ridge in Sicily, alive because someone had known more than he did. He said, "Understood." He signed the directive. Ferris took the folder, stood up, and left, without another word. The door closed. The farmhouse went quiet, and Holloway sat alone with the map and the particular silence that follows a decision that has already been made for you. He called in Sergeant Raymond Cross, 26 years old, Liverpool, the kind of man who laughed too loud at bad jokes and worked twice as hard as anyone asked him to. Cross read the relevant portions of the directive and said, "So we watch and wait." Holloway said, "Correct." Cross said, "And the medical camp?" Holloway said, "The corridor is assessed as low risk. The order accounts for it." Cross looked at him, not with disrespect, with that particular expression he had, the one that meant he had a different feeling in his stomach, but trusted his officer enough to keep it there. He said, "Right." That word landed and sat between them like something neither of them wanted to examine too closely. What neither of them knew, what no one in that farmhouse knew yet, was that 6 hours earlier, in a cellar in Caen, the man inside the German signals unit had made a mistake. A small one, the kind of mistake that looks like nothing until someone starts looking for exactly that kind of nothing. A timing inconsistency in a transmission log, 3 minutes off from where it should have been. A German signals officer named Klaus Berger had written it down in a notebook, underlined it, and shown it to his superior. His superior had said, "Watch him." The man was already compromised. He did not know it yet, and the people who needed to know it had not been told. But we will come back to that too. That night, Holloway walked the perimeter alone. The channel was alive with the low sound of ships, something you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. Tomorrow was everything. Tomorrow, the beaches. Tomorrow, the plan that had been assembled over months in rooms like that farmhouse would meet the actual world, which had never once cooperated with a plan in the history of warfare. He stopped at the eastern edge of the field and looked toward the corridor. He thought about the agent, a man whose name he did not know, sitting inside a German unit, staying alive, one transmission at a time. He thought about what it meant to be that man, to be the piece on the board that no one could sacrifice openly, but that everyone was quietly willing to sacrifice if the numbers demanded it. He thought about the medical camp, and then specifically he thought about the nurse he had passed on the road 3 days ago. She had been directing supply trucks with the confidence of someone who had been doing it for years, pointing and calling out without looking up from her clipboard. Someone nearby had called out her name, Margaret. She had not looked up. She had just said, "Yes, one moment." He did not know why he remembered that. He remembered it. He went back inside. He told himself the system was sound. He told himself about Sicily. He told himself that Ferris was intelligence, that Ferris had access to information he could not see, that the man inside the German unit had confirmed the corridor was clear. He went to sleep. He was good at following orders. That was the thing about James Holloway. He was very, very good at it. At 05:30 on June 6, 1944, the operation began. Holloway's unit moved into position along the southern edge of the corridor before first light. The sound from the north was immense. The beaches were being taken. Somewhere in the noise and the dark and the water, the operation was doing what operations do, which is cost more than anyone planned for. Cross settled in beside Holloway and said, "Quiet on our end." Holloway said, "Yes." Cross said, "Reckon it stays that way." Holloway said, "Intelligence says it will." Cross looked east. He said, "Sure." 2 hours passed. The corridor was empty. The mist sat low over the fields. Holloway watched the tree line and the road and felt the specific tedium of waiting, which in warfare is never actually tedious, because underneath it is always the awareness that tedium can end in a fraction of a second. "At 07:48, Cross said. "Sir." Holloway raised his binoculars before the word finished. At the far end of the corridor, where the road bent around a line of low hedges, something was moving through the morning mist. Still distant, still unclear, but moving west. Holloway pressed the radio handset and called the command post. Static. He called again. Static. Cross said quietly, not moving the binoculars from his eyes. "That is armor." Holloway called the command post again. Static. He kept the binoculars up. The shapes in the mist were resolving themselves the way certainty resolves itself when you have been trying to avoid it. Steel. Tracks. The unmistakable geometry of German armored vehicles in column formation, moving through the corridor that Colonel Edmund Ferris had assessed as low risk, moving west, moving toward a medical camp 3 kilometers behind their position, where, at that exact moment, the first trucks from the beach landings were arriving with their cargo of broken men. And somewhere in that camp, a woman named Margaret was already on her feet, clipboard in hand, pointing and directing and not looking up, because there was too much to do, and the morning had only just started. Holloway lowered his binoculars. He pressed the handset one more time. Static. He looked at Cross. Cross was already looking at him, not with the stomach expression this time, with something harder, something that was asking a question without using words. Holloway looked back at the column. He had 40 men. He had position. He had less than 4 minutes before that column reached a point where engagement would still matter. He had a directive. He had a code he had not received. He had a dead agent whose compromise had not yet been communicated up the chain. He had a system he believed in the way a man believes in the ground under his feet. He had 42 men who went home from Sicily because someone trusted the plan. He pressed the radio one more time. Static. He said nothing. He waited for Amber Gate. The column moved west. 3 kilometers is not a long distance. A healthy man can walk 3 kilometers in 35 minutes. A vehicle can cover it in under 4. A sound, the right kind of sound, a scream or an explosion, can travel 3 kilometers in seconds. Holloway knew the distance exactly. He had measured it on the map twice the night before. He had noted it the way you note a thing that you hope will remain theoretical. 3 kilometers between his position and the medical camp. 3 kilometers between the column he was watching and the place where Margaret Ellison was standing with a clipboard, directing trucks, not looking up. He pressed the radio handset again. Static. Cross was watching him. Not the column. Holloway. Because Cross already knew what the column was doing. What he did not know was what Holloway was going to do about it. Holloway said, "Keep trying the command post." Every 30 seconds. Cross said, "Yes, sir." He said it without expression, which was its own kind of expression. Holloway put the binoculars back up. Through the glass, the column was clearer now. 4 vehicles, possibly 5. The lead vehicle was a half-track, which meant infantry behind armor, which meant this was not a patrol. This was a deliberate movement. Someone had given an order, looked at a map, pointed at a road, and said, "Go that way." and the men in those vehicles had gone that way because that is what soldiers do when someone points at a map and gives an order. Holloway understood that perfectly. Private Denny Walsh, 19 years old, from a small town in County Cork that he described as having more cows than people, crawled up beside Holloway and said, "Sir, we have a line to Lieutenant Graves at the forward post." Holloway said, "Put him through." The radio crackled, and Graves came on, his voice compressed and urgent. "Holloway, are you seeing what I am seeing?" Holloway said, "I am seeing it." Graves said, "What are we doing?" Holloway said, "Waiting for authorization." There was a pause on the line, not a long one, but the kind of pause that has weight in it. Graves said, "The camp, James." He used his first name. Officers did not use first names on radio. When Graves said James, what he meant was, "I am talking to you as a human being right now, not as a rank." Holloway said, "I know where the camp is, Lieutenant." Graves said, "Then," Holloway said, "we are waiting for authorization. Keep trying the command post on your end." He handed the handset back to Walsh. Walsh was looking at him. Walsh was 19. He had the face of someone who had not yet assembled the internal architecture that allows a person to watch something terrible approach, without their face showing every thought they are having. His face was showing all of them. Holloway said, "Eyes on the column, Walsh." Walsh said, "Yes, sir." He turned back, but not before Holloway saw it. At the medical camp, the morning had already become something that required more hands than were available. The first trucks had arrived at 0720. 17 men from the beach landings. Wounds that ranged from fragment injuries to things that required immediate surgery. By 0800, there were 31. By 0830, there were 44. Captain Arthur Rennie, the senior medical officer, was moving between cots with the focused calm of a man who had learned to convert panic into precision. His hands did not shake, his voice did not rise. He had seen enough that his body had simply stopped performing distress and had committed entirely to function. Margaret Ellison was managing intake. Name, unit, wound classification, priority. She had done this enough times that she could assess and record in under 40 seconds per man. She was fast. She was steady. And she was, in the way of people who are very good at their work, completely unaware of the column moving through the mist 3 kilometers to the east. She was kneeling beside a boy from Manchester, no older than 20, who was holding his own hand with his other hand because there was no one else to hold it, when she heard something. Not an explosion. Not yet. Something earlier than that. A low mechanical sound that did not belong to a supply truck. She looked up. She looked east. The mist was still thick, and the hedgerows were high, and she could not see anything. She went back to the boy from Manchester. She said, "What is your name?" He said, "Thomas." She said, "Thomas, you are going to be fine. I need you to look at me and not at your arm." He looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly the amount of time it took for her to make a decision about his priority classification. And then she wrote it down and moved to the next man. She did not hear the sound again. Holloway heard Cross say, 3 minutes, sir. Estimate 3 minutes before they reach the point where engagement becomes ineffective. 3 minutes. 180 seconds. He had 40 men in position. He had a clear line of fire on a column that did not yet know he was there. If he engaged now, right now, the column would be destroyed before it covered another 500 meters. He pressed the handset. Static. He pressed it again. Static. And then from somewhere inside him, the voice that had been trained over years and 2 theaters of war said, "The system is sound. Ferris had access. You do not have." The agent confirmed the corridor was clear. "There is a reason for this order. There is always a reason. You signed the directive. You trusted the plan in Sicily, and 42 men went home. You trust it now." Cross said, "Sir." Holloway said, "I heard you." Cross said, 2.5 minutes. Holloway said, "Keep trying the command post." Cross picked up the handset. He tried the command post. Static. He tried the forward relay. Static. He tried the secondary frequency that was listed in the directive as a fallback. A burst of noise, voices, the compressed chaos of a larger operation playing out across multiple channels, and then static again. Walsh said, very quietly, not to anyone in particular, "Come on." Holloway looked at the column. He looked at his men positioned along the ridge. He looked at the road that led west toward the camp. He thought about Ferris, about the clean boots and the pressed uniform and the eyes that priced things, about the agent inside the German signals unit, who was the reason for the order, about 9 months of intelligence, about several hundred Allied lives. He thought about Sicily. He pressed the handset one final time and spoke clearly and slowly. "This is Captain James Holloway. Authorization request, corridor engagement. Please respond." The static held for 3 seconds, and then a voice came through. It was not the command post. It was Graves again, on the forward line, and his voice had changed in a way that made Holloway's stomach drop before he had processed a single word. Graves said, "Holloway, I have a runner from the camp. They are reporting a sound, east of their position. They are asking if we are aware of movement in the corridor." The camp was already hearing it. Holloway said, "Tell them to prepare to relocate non-critical patients." There was a pause. Then Graves said, "They want to know if they should evacuate." Holloway looked at the column. The lead vehicle was past the hedgerow now, fully visible, not mist-obscured. Steel and tracks, and a German infantry column moving west with the unhurried certainty of something that did not expect to be stopped. Holloway said, "Tell them to stand by." Graves said, "James," that word again, first name, not rank. Holloway said, "Stand by. I am waiting for authorization." The silence on the line was the loudest thing he had heard all morning. He released the handset, Cross said, and his voice was flat now, completely flat, the voice of a man who has put every feeling somewhere inaccessible because the alternative is not functional. 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Holloway looked at his men. Walsh. Cross. 18 other faces along the ridge, each of them watching him with the same waiting expression. They had their weapons. They had their position. They were ready. They were waiting for one word. One word from him and the column stopped. One word and the camp was safe. One word. He did not say it. He pressed the handset. Static. He pressed it again. Static. Cross said, 60 seconds. And then, at the exact moment that the number 60 landed in the air between them, something happened that none of them expected. The radio crackled. A real signal. A voice. Command post frequency. Finally, a clean line cutting through everything. Holloway pressed the handset and said, "This is Holloway. I need Amber Gate authorization, corridor engagement. I have armor moving west toward the medical camp. I need the code now." The voice on the other end said something, but the line was not as clean as it had seemed. The words came through fractured, half-assembled, like a sentence with pieces missing. Holloway pressed the handset. Say again. Say again clearly. The voice said, "We are aware of the—" and then it broke. Holloway said, "Are you authorizing engagement, Ambergate, yes or no?" The line broke entirely. Not static. Silence. The channel dropped. Walsh said, "Sir." Holloway did not respond. Walsh said, "Sir, they are 30 seconds out." Holloway was staring at the radio. Not at the column, at the radio, as if the authorization code was physically inside it, and he could retrieve it by looking hard enough. Cross said, and now even the flatness in his voice had cracked slightly, just at the edges. "James, the camp." Holloway looked up. The column was close enough now that he could hear the engine sound without the binoculars. That low mechanical sound that did not belong to a supply truck. The same sound that Margaret Ellison had heard 3 kilometers away, and looked up at, and then looked away from. He looked at his men. He looked at the directive in his breast pocket. He looked at Cross. Cross was not giving him the stomach expression anymore. Cross was looking at him with something that would take Holloway several years and a very different kind of room to fully understand. It was not accusation. It was witness. Cross was memorizing this moment in the way that people memorize things they know they will carry for the rest of their lives. Holloway opened his mouth, and at that exact moment, from the direction of the medical camp, 3 kilometers west, the first explosion rolled across the fields like a sound that the morning had been building toward all along. Then the second. Then, after a pause that felt obscene in its smallness, the third. Walsh made a sound that was not a word. Cross closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. Holloway stood completely still. The radio in his hand was silent. Amber Gate never came. The boy from Manchester died at 0814. Not from his wound. His wound was survivable. Thomas died because the first explosion collapsed the supply tent directly onto the surgical area, and in the chaos that followed, no one reached him in time. He was found 40 minutes later, still on his cot, his good hand wrapped around his injured one. He was 20 years old. That is not a detail. That is the whole story. Everything else is just the explanation of how it happened. Holloway was moving before Cross finished saying his name. He did not give the order to engage. There was nothing left to engage. The column had already passed the point where stopping it would save the camp. What he gave instead was the order to advance, which is a different thing entirely. Advancing toward an enemy that has already done what it came to do is not tactical. It is something older than tactics. It is the thing that happens in a man when the system he trusted produces a result his body refuses to accept standing still. He ran. His men ran with him. Walsh was on his left, Cross on his right, and behind them the sound of 40 soldiers moving through a field at full speed, which is a sound that carries its own particular weight when you know what they are running toward. The column had not stopped at the camp. It had moved through it, which was almost worse. A column that stops and holds a position can be retaken. A column that moves through leaves behind only what it has already done. They engaged the rear of the column 800 meters west of the camp. It lasted 11 minutes. Holloway did not think during those 11 minutes. His body ran the actions it had been trained to run, and his mind went somewhere else entirely. Not blank, the opposite of blank, full of something that had no name yet and would not have one for a long time. When it was over, the column was destroyed. All 5 vehicles. 31 German soldiers, dead or captured. No losses on Holloway's side. By any military accounting, it was a clean result. Cross stood beside the lead vehicle, looked at the smoking wreckage, and said nothing. He had a cut above his eye from a fragment. He had not noticed it yet. The blood was running down the side of his face, and he was not noticing it, because he was looking west, toward the camp, toward the smoke that was rising from that direction, in a way that smoke should not rise from a medical facility on a Tuesday morning in June. Walsh was sick in the field behind the road, quietly, without drawing attention to it. Then he wiped his mouth, picked up his weapon, and walked back to his position without saying anything. He was 19 years old, and he had just done the thing that 19-year-old soldiers do, which is process the unprocessable by simply continuing to move. Holloway said, "Cross. Take 4 men and establish a perimeter. Walsh, with me." He walked west. The camp was not gone. That was the first thing he registered. The word catastrophe had constructed an image in his mind that was total, complete, absolute. What he found was worse in a different way. Partial, specific, the kind of damage that has faces. 2 tents were destroyed. One had been the surgical area. One had been the primary recovery ward. The supply structure had partially collapsed. The rest of the camp was standing, and the people in it were doing what medical personnel do in the immediate aftermath of something terrible, which is work. Just work. Move, assess, act, move again. Captain Rennie was in the middle of it. His hands were moving, his voice was level. He saw Holloway, and he did not stop what he was doing. He said, 47. Holloway said, "What?" Rennie said, 47 people were in this camp when the column came through. I need you to understand that number before anything else. 47. Holloway said, "How many?" Rennie said, 11 confirmed dead. 17 wounded, several critically. 19 unaccounted for, because we are still pulling people out of the collapsed structure. He paused. He was wrapping a wound on a man who was sitting on the ground, staring at nothing. He did not look up. He said, "I had a surgical team in that tent, Captain. 3 people. I do not know where they are yet." Holloway stood in the middle of the camp and looked at what the morning had made. Walsh was standing 2 steps behind him, not speaking. His face had reorganized itself from the expression in the field into something quieter and more permanent. He was looking at a cot near the edge of the destroyed recovery ward. On it, neatly folded, was a nurse's jacket, blue, with a name tag that was visible from where they were standing. "Ellison," M. Walsh said. "Sir." Holloway said, "I see it." He crossed to the cot. He picked up the jacket. He held it for a moment, and then put it back exactly as he had found it, which was a thing he did without understanding why. The way people perform small, careful acts when they are standing inside something they cannot yet measure. A voice said, "Captain Holloway." He turned. Margaret Ellison was standing at the entrance to the remaining medical tent. She had a bandage on her left forearm, already dark at the center. Her hair was down, which meant something had happened to the pins she kept it with. Her clipboard was gone. But she was standing, and she was looking at him with an expression that he had no preparation for. She was not angry. That would have been easier. She looked at him, the way people look at something they are trying to understand, and cannot. She said, "You were in position." It was not a question. Holloway said, "Yes." She said, "We could hear engines." 20 minutes before the first explosion. I heard them, and I looked east and I thought, our people are there? Someone is there? They can see this? They will stop it. Holloway said nothing. She said, Thomas Ware died 40 minutes ago. He came in this morning with a fragment wound to the forearm. Completely survivable. He was stable. He died because no one reached him in the chaos. She said it without performance, without volume, the way people state facts when the facts are so large that any additional weight would be redundant. Holloway said, I had orders. He said it because it was true, and because it was the only true thing he had to offer. And he offered it, knowing exactly how it would land. Margaret Ellison looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, so did I. And she walked back inside the tent. Holloway found a wall at the edge of the camp and sat down against it. He did not sit down because he was tired. He sat down because his legs had made a decision his mind had not caught up to yet. He sat with his back against the rough stone and his hands on his knees, and he looked at the field in front of him, which was just a field, ordinary, green, slightly wet from the morning, entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in its vicinity. He thought about the radio. He thought about the broken transmission, the voice that had come through fractured and incomplete, the channel that had dropped at the exact moment it mattered. He thought about whether the authorization had been coming, whether someone at the command post had been reaching for the word Amber Gate, and the line had died before they could deliver it. He thought about the alternative, that no authorization was coming, that the system he had trusted had simply failed. Not through malice, through the ordinary, catastrophic incompetence of information moving too slowly through too many layers on a morning when the entire continent was simultaneously on fire. He thought about Ferris. Clean boots, pressed uniform. The assessment is solid. He thought about the agent inside the German signals unit, the man whose protection had been the reason for the order. He did not yet know that the man had been compromised 6 hours before the column moved. He would learn that later, in a different room, from a different man with clean boots. And when he learned it, something would finish breaking that had started breaking on the ridge with the binoculars and the static and the column moving west. But right now, he did not know that. Right now, he sat against a wall in a damaged medical camp, and he held the morning in his mind, and he turned it over and looked at every side of it. He had followed the order. He had done exactly what the directive said. He had waited for Amber Gate. He had tried the command post. He had done everything correctly. 11 people were dead. Thomas Ware was dead. Somewhere inside the remaining tent, Margaret Ellison was working with a bandage on her arm and no clipboard, assessing and recording and moving to the next person, because that is what you do when there is still work to do, and the work is the only thing that makes the morning bearable. Holloway looked at his hands. They were clean. He had not noticed that until now. In the 11 minutes of engagement, in the advance through the field, in everything that had followed, his hands had somehow stayed clean. He did not know why that bothered him more than anything else. Walsh appeared around the corner of the wall, looked at Holloway, and sat down next to him without being asked or told. He sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. He did not say anything. He was 19 years old, and he did not have the words yet, but he understood that sitting next to someone is sometimes the only true thing you can offer them. They sat against the wall together. The field was green. The smoke was still rising. Somewhere to the north, the operation was continuing. 3 weeks later, in a room in London that smelled like old paper and cold tea, a man Holloway had never met read aloud from a report and said, "You acted in full compliance with Directive 7-4. No disciplinary action is recommended." He said it the way people say things that are technically true and entirely insufficient at the same time. Holloway sat across the table and listened to the sound of the system absolving itself. There were 4 men in the room. Holloway, a legal officer whose name he had already forgotten, an adjutant who was there to take notes and who had the expression of someone who wished he were somewhere else, and Colonel Edmund Ferris, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his boots clean and his uniform pressed, and his hands folded in front of him, like a man waiting for a meeting to finish so he can get to the next one. The legal officer said, "The breakdown in communication has been attributed to equipment failure during a high-volume operational period. This has been noted and will be addressed in the next review cycle." Holloway said, "The agent was already compromised when the column moved." The legal officer looked at his papers. He said, "That information became available at," Holloway said, 6 hours before. The agent was compromised 6 hours before the column entered the corridor. Someone knew, and the order was not updated. The room was quiet. Ferris said, "The intelligence chain operates under significant pressure during active operations. Delays in communication are," Holloway said, 47 people were in that camp. Ferris said, "Captain," Holloway said, 11 of them died. One of them was 20 years old, and his wound was survivable, and he died because the camp went into chaos before anyone reached him. His name was Thomas Ware. He said the name the way you say a name when you need the people in the room to understand that it belongs to a person, and not to a number in a report. Ferris looked at him. For a moment something moved behind the clean, calculating surface of his eyes. Something that might have been, in a different man, in a different room, the beginning of accountability. Then it was gone. He said, "The operation was a strategic success. The corridor held. The larger objective was achieved." Holloway said nothing. The legal officer shuffled his papers. He said, "As stated, no disciplinary action is recommended. You are cleared to return to your unit, Captain. This matter is considered closed." Closed. Holloway looked at the word hanging in the air above the table. He thought about what closed meant to the legal officer, to Ferris, to the adjutant, with his notes. He thought about what closed meant to Thomas Ware's mother, who had received a telegram 3 days ago and who did not know, would never know, that her son's death had been the downstream consequence of an order that was obsolete before it was ever followed. He stood up. He picked up his cap. He looked at Ferris one last time. He said, "You told me the assessment was solid." Ferris held his gaze. He said, "It was solid at the time it was made." Holloway put on his cap. He walked out. He did not go back to his unit that day. He walked. London in July. The war still running in every direction. The city carrying its damage with the particular exhausted dignity of a place that has learned to function around its own wounds. He walked for 2 hours without direction, which was something he had never done in his adult life, because Holloway was a man who always knew where he was going and why. He sat down on a bench near the river and watched the water. He thought about Sicily, about 42 men who went home. about the lesson he had taken from that, which he had held for 2 years like a compass, like proof of something fundamental about how the world worked when you trusted the people above you to see more than you could see. He turned that lesson over in his hands now and looked at it from the other side. The lesson had not been wrong. His commanding officer in Sicily had known something Holloway did not. The retreat had been correct. The 42 men had gone home. But the lesson had become something else over time. It had calcified. It had stopped being a principle and become a reflex. Trust the system. Trust the order. The people above you, no more. You sign the directive, and you wait for the code, and you do not move until you are told to move, because the last time you trusted yourself over the plan, you were wrong. Except he had not trusted himself over the plan on the morning of June 6th. He had trusted the plan. And the plan had been running on information that was 6 hours out of date, transmitted through equipment that failed at the worst possible moment, built on an agent who was already burned before the first truck from the beaches arrived at the camp. The plan had not known any of that. The plan had not known anything. The plan was paper. He was the one with the binoculars. He was the one who could see the column. He was the one standing on the ridge with 40 men and a clear line of fire and 3 kilometers and 4 minutes. He had waited. He had waited because he believed that the system was smarter than he was. And the system had not been smarter than he was. The system had simply been larger, and larger is not the same thing as smarter. Larger means more pieces, more layers, more places for something to go wrong, more distance between the man who makes the decision and the man who lives with the consequence. Ferris had not been in that field. Ferris had not heard the static. Ferris had not watched the column move through the mist while the handset produced nothing. Ferris had been in a room with clean boots, and when it was over, he had been in a different room with clean boots. And the distance between those 2 rooms and the field was the distance between the order and its cost. Holloway looked at the river. He thought about Margaret Ellison, about the way she had said "so did I" and walked back inside. He had gone back to the camp twice in the weeks that followed. Both times she had been working. Both times she had acknowledged him with the brief, neutral nod of a person who has decided what they think about something and does not need to revisit it. She had not been cruel. She had been something harder than cruel. She had been finished. The second time he went back, he had brought nothing, said nothing, stood near the entrance for a few minutes, and then left. Walsh had been with him. On the way back, Walsh had said, "Do you think she will ever?" and then had stopped because he was 19 and he did not know how to finish the sentence. And Holloway had said, "No." And that had been the end of it. He sat on the bench near the river for a long time. When he finally stood up, he did not feel resolved. Resolution is what happens in stories when a character learns something and the learning closes the wound. What Holloway felt was different, more permanent, less clean. He had learned something, but the learning did not return anything. It did not bring back Thomas Ware. It did not change the morning of June 6th. It did not make Ferris accountable, or the system smaller, or the distance between the order and its cost any shorter. What it did was change him, not into something worse, not into a man who distrusted everything and trusted nothing, into something more precise, a man who understood that an order is a tool, and that a tool is only as good as the conditions under which it was designed, and that conditions change, and that the man holding the tool is responsible for knowing when the conditions have changed enough that the tool no longer applies. An order is not a conscience. It was never supposed to be. He had signed the directive and surrendered his judgment entirely, and 11 people had paid for the difference between his judgment and the judgment of a system that was not present in the field on the morning it mattered. That was not compliance. That was abdication. And there was no version of the word following orders that made those two things different in any way that mattered to Thomas Ware's mother. He requested a transfer 3 days later. Not a resignation, not a breakdown. A transfer to a forward unit, active engagement, the kind of position where the distance between the order and the consequence was as short as possible, where he could see what he was deciding and decide it with his eyes open. The request was granted. He served for 11 more months. He made decisions in those months, some of them wrong, some of them right, all of them his. He did not stop following orders. He followed them with something added, a constant assessment, running underneath every directive, a question that he asked himself every time a situation changed, and the order had not. Does this order still know what I know right now? Sometimes the answer was yes. Once, it was no. He disengaged without authorization. He pulled his men back from a position that an hour-old order had told him to hold, because the position had changed and the order had not, and he could see what the order could not see. 2 men went home because of it. He was reprimanded in writing. He accepted the reprimand without argument. He kept the reprimand in his breast pocket for the rest of the war. Not out of bitterness, as a reminder, not of what the system had done to him, of what he had let the system do. Because that is the thing about blind obedience that no one tells you before it costs you something. It does not feel like blindness when you are doing it. It feels like discipline. It feels like humility. It feels like the wisdom of deferring to people who know more than you do. It only looks like blindness afterward. When the field is quiet and the smoke has risen and you are sitting against a wall with clean hands, and a boy from Manchester is dead from a survivable wound, and the radio in your hand has been silent for 40 minutes, and the word you were waiting for never came, then it looks exactly like what it was.